In October 2006, an elderly man named John Schmitt locked the door to his office. He had spent 40 years as a senior specialist restoring classified U.S. archives. That day, he retired and moved to a remote rural part of Maine. He gave no interviews to journalists. He wrote no memoirs. He simply wanted to disappear. But 3 months before that, something happened that made NASA leadership declare him insane. Schmitt was speaking at a closed symposium for film and television engineers. Someone in the audience asked him a routine question about the restoration quality of old lunar archives. John stepped up to the microphone, paused, and quietly said a sentence that left the room in dead silence. "You're discussing the contrast levels of copies that went through 3 stages of compression back in the 70s. But for some reason, none of you has asked about the main storage facility in Greenbelt. No one has asked where the 13 original boxes with special markings disappeared to. They were labeled Project Nightfall, July 1947. Those were the original Hangar films, the ones I personally held in my hands. Films that NASA's official restoration process never touched, because we were ordered to destroy them. After that, Schmidt's microphone was quickly cut off, and the session was declared closed. Official representatives of the space agency still call those words a lapse in memory. But you know what? This has nothing to do with conspiracy theories. We're used to thinking that space agencies preserve every frame of our history. But if you start digging into the timeline of so-called accidental losses in the archives, a frightening truth comes to the surface. The most important footage of the 20th century doesn't disappear because of fires or floods. It disappears by direct order of people who very much do not want us to see the original. This is the story of what was really stored on the 1947 films, and of the one man who managed to see them before they turned to ash. If you, like me, want to know what the official textbooks are hiding, take a moment, subscribe to the channel right now, and hit the like button under this video. It costs you nothing, but the algorithms will understand that people need investigations like this. Every like from you is one more lantern lit against the approaching darkness. If you're with me, light yours, and let's go down into the basements of the Greenbelt archive. John Schmitt spent more than half his life in those underground storage rooms. The official story, the one any documentary will tell you today, sounds very sad. In 2006, NASA officially admitted that it had permanently lost the original moon landing tapes, the very footage where Neil Armstrong takes his famous first step. Officials threw up their hands and blamed it all on ordinary human negligence. Supposedly, in the 1970s, the agency was facing a severe shortage of magnetic tape for satellites. So the old reels were simply wiped with a magnetic field and reused to record new weather data. All we were left with were flat, blurry television copies that had been broadcast to the entire world at the time. But in his private work journals, John Schmitt describes a completely different reality. His son miraculously saved those journals and partially published them on an independent forum in 2019. The archives of the Goddard Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, are not some warehouse of forgotten junk. They are a sterile underground bunker with constant climate control and an automated security system. A strict 3-level clearance system operates there. You physically cannot just walk in, grab a box from a shelf, and record a weather forecast over it. Every move by any employee is logged in 3 places at once: on paper, on magnetic records, and at the security post. Films like that do not lose themselves. They are removed deliberately. In August 1974, Schmitt was transferred to a special closed Sector B. He was the best young specialist in the restoration of damaged, fragile, dried-out motion picture film. Someone who knew how to work with old nitrate emulsion that could ignite from the slightest spark. His main assignment in the new position was to preserve, duplicate, and catalog old 35mm reels that were brought into the storage facility every week from closed military departments, decommissioned bases, and strategic Pentagon archives, bypassing standard channels. And then, on one ordinary working Tuesday, 3 heavy galvanized boxes were placed on his desk, sealed with wax stamps that clearly had not been broken in several decades. They did not bear the familiar round NASA emblem, but instead displayed an old stamp of the U.S. War Department and a code name stenciled in black oil paint. Project Nightfall. Hangar tapes. July 1947. Under his job instructions, Schmitt was required to immediately run the old film through a special editing table with soft diode backlighting. He had to check the level of base deterioration and document any defects. And what he saw on that original, clean, completely unedited negative made him stop breathing and freeze in front of the screen, forgetting the instructions, the logbooks, and the surveillance camera hanging above his head. The footage had been shot on a handheld Bell & Howell military camera, the kind frontline cameramen used in the 1940s to document tests of new equipment. The images were incredibly sharp and deep, without the slightest hint of the graininess, digital compression, or soft focus we are used to seeing. The film captured, in full detail, the interior of a huge, long, grim military hangar whose walls were built from gray corrugated metal. But judging by the markings on the heavy lifting equipment, electrical panels, and tool crates, this was not the notorious Roswell that UFO researchers are always shouting about. This was the top-secret, closed Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. On the gray concrete floor of that hangar, directly on tarpaulin sheets, lay 3 massive, twisted fragments of some completely unknown structure. They looked as if a dark, almost black metal had first flowed like liquid mercury, and then, instantly, in a fraction of a second, frozen into bizarre, torn, aerodynamic shapes. No matter how hard John stared at the editing table screen, he could not see a single technological seam, not one rivet, bolt, or the slightest trace of ordinary human welding on those fragments, as if the object had been cast as one solid piece in some unknown mold. High-ranking Army officers in 1940s dress uniforms, grim men in civilian overcoats, and scientists in heavy rubber aprons kept moving in and out of the frame. They bustled around the debris, measured its parameters with strange round instruments with needle gauges that Schmitt had never seen in any official technical catalog, and carefully entered the data on clipboards. But the most astonishing discovery came a little later, when John decided to study the film-damaged structure through a powerful optical microscope installed on his workbench. He projected an enlarged freeze frame onto the large control screen and looked closely at the internal structure of the fracture in that mysterious, dark outer skin, which at first glance appeared to be an ordinary deformed sheet of titanium. This metal was not the result of ordinary casting or pressing. Its internal structure consisted of millions of microscopic hollow silicon or quartz tubes, each only a few microns in diameter. They were intricately interwoven in dozens of layers, resembling the fibers of expensive organic fabric or the cable networks of modern supercomputers. The second box contained similar footage documenting the fragments from other angles, but the third reel, which John Schmitt opened with trembling hands, contained footage from a fully isolated medical compartment, and John emphasized in his secret journals that this footage had absolutely nothing in common with the ridiculous, cheap, fake alien autopsy that was shown on television in the mid-1990s. A biological body did indeed lie on a stainless steel operating table, but the focus of the cameraman's handheld camera had been deliberately shifted away from the table itself. The operator filmed in detail the documents, reports, and expert forms that a military doctor in a white mask was turning over and reading at that very moment, blocking the light. Schmitt clearly managed to read the large typewritten heading on the top sheet, Preliminary Analysis of Biological Object, July 4th. Incident. The anatomy of the being on the original military film completely contradicted every familiar Hollywood cliché and every fantasy story about little green men. It was an incredibly complex, frightening biomechanical organism in which living organic tissues resembling muscle fibers had been grown at the cellular level around metallic and silicon control nodes, microcircuits, and flexible waveguides. John Schmitt, following strict protocol, carefully documented the technical condition of all three reels, entered their codes into the system, assigned them new archive numbers, and placed the boxes in a high-security safe. He locked it with every lock, sealed it with his personal stamp, and went home, firmly determined to question his immediate supervisor in detail the next morning about the origin of these astonishing Army materials. But just 2 days later, on Thursday morning, 3 men in identical dark suits and raincoats entered his quiet work department without warning and without knocking. They were personally accompanied by the head of security at the Goddard Space Flight Center, who silently presented Schmitt right at the doorway with an official directive from the U.S. National Security Council signed by senior defense officials. All accounting logs, registration books, and magnetic cards for the current week were immediately seized by the escorting officers right in front of the stunned archivist. The pages from the paper ledger on which John had personally registered the galvanized boxes of Project Nightfall were carefully and cold-bloodedly cut out with a knife. The galvanized reels themselves were loaded into a special reinforced container and carried away in an unknown direction. When John timidly tried to ask where the materials were being taken, the head of Goddard Security slowly turned toward him. He stepped close, looked Schmitt straight in the eyes, and said dryly, "Schmitt, you're just a civilian restorer, and your only job is to clean dirt off old footage of captured German V-2 rocket launches. What you saw here over the last 2 days never existed in nature. It was simply an emulsion defect. If you open your mouth outside this office, your federal pension and your health insurance will be canceled that very second. And if I'm not mistaken, you have a wonderful family out in the suburbs and a little boy growing up. Think about his future." It was then, in the mid-1970s, deep inside the United States secret analytical agencies, that a brilliant and cynical plan took shape, one that would forever change the principles of working with information. They understood that simply hiding or classifying important archives in underground vaults was an outdated, unreliable, and extremely dangerous stage. There is always the human factor. There will always be some dedicated John Schmitt who accidentally stumbles upon a box, sees the hidden footage, makes a copy, or simply tells his loved ones about it before he dies. That is why Pentagon strategists launched a global, large-scale, and very polished program under the code name Digital Restoration and Optimization of National Space Archives. Under the pretext of saving fading history and converting old, dangerous films into a safe format, a great and systematic erasure of the past began. Original negatives from the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s containing inconvenient facts began to be shipped in bulk from every state to a special closed base for final disposal. Officially, they were melted down on an industrial scale to extract precious silver from the emulsion, and they were destroyed in special high-temperature furnaces under the pretext of the extreme fire hazard posed by old nitrate film stock. And the global public, historians and journalists, were handed a nice story about digitization for your convenience in perfect 4K quality. But they deliberately kept silent about the most important mechanism of that digital cleanup, which was technically hidden from independent researchers and ordinary citizens for many years. Before final digitization and public release, absolutely every frame of old military footage passed through strict, multi-stage censorship filters in specialized software systems. Anything that did not match the official version of history approved in government offices was simply erased with advanced digital brushes and replaced with ground texture. Whether it was anomalous geometric objects in lunar panoramic images, strange flashes in space, or technical details of the 1947 Hangar debris that shattered terrestrial physics, and the originals on which independent verification of the authenticity of light and emulsion composition could have been performed, turned into gray ash, leaving future generations no chance. John Schmitt remained silent for more than 30 years of his underground, quiet, outwardly comfortable existence inside the archive service, drawing no unnecessary attention from his colleague. He fully submitted to that ruthless government system in order to raise his children, pay off the mortgage on his house, and live out his old age peacefully on his quiet, secluded farm. But just before his death, in cold November 2009, he called his eldest son to his bedside and dictated his final, most important words into an old cassette recorder. The biggest and most terrifying lie your generation was forced to obediently believe is the myth that truth always eventually comes out. It does not. If you have enough money, a monopoly on the archives, and powerful institutions of authority, you can do absolutely anything to people's minds. Without firing a single shot, you can erase entire decades from history by replacing real physical evidence with a sterile and very convincing digital fake. And people around you will happily tap on their screens, argue about trivial things, never realizing how cynically and deeply they have been robbed, stripped of their true inheritance. NASA's official leadership still states at every press conference that Project Nightfall is fiction, and the personnel file of employee John Schmitt in the space agency's archives is now completely locked, with access denied on grounds of U.S. national security. But the old brick walls of the agencies and the deep underground bunkers of Greenbelt still stand in their places, holding in their basements the echo of that distant technological era. And somewhere there, in the farthest special vaults, behind 3 armored doors, perhaps those 13 galvanized boxes of Project Nightfall still lie, remembering the real history. To fully understand the true scale of this cleanup, you have to understand how the technology of automatic data concealment was built at the level of electronic hardware itself. In 1978, an incident occurred at the Goddard Space Flight Center that not a single newspaper in Washington or New York wrote about, classified at the highest level. A young software engineer named David Klein was conducting a routine technical inspection of the magnetic storage units of the massive Telex 360 computer series purchased for the center's needs. These storage units were used around the clock to process telemetry data coming in from deep space communication stations in Australia, Madrid, and the Mojave Desert in California. Klein accidentally stumbled upon a strange discrepancy in the volume of archived data. One of the old magnetic tapes was missing nearly 40 gigabytes of raw information. By the standards of the late 1970s, this was a colossal, unimaginable amount of data, equivalent to hundreds of hours of continuous video recording from all tracking satellites. When David attempted to run the standard log file to recover the damaged sector, the operating system froze completely and displayed a critical error on the terminal with the code Delta Clearance Access Blocked. Within 2 hours, Klein was summoned to the director's office, where an unfamiliar man in a gray suit and a military uniform without any insignia or name tags was waiting for him. He was not threatened with a tribunal or prison. They simply handed him, in silence, a pre-printed form ordering his immediate transfer to a closed civilian facility in Ohio. All his personal work notebooks, code drafts, and even a small magnetic diskette containing the recorded error code were seized by internal security personnel directly from his desk. In his personal letters to his wife Mary, which researchers discovered in the Klein family's private archive only in 2014, David wrote astonishing things. "They aren't just manually deleting inconvenient files, Mary. They are changing the basic architecture of how incoming space data from the stations is read at the center. The new optical scanners we are now purchasing in bulk from IBM under closed contracts have secret hardware firmware that we cannot control. This microcode at the transistor level automatically recognizes certain types of optical noise, shadows, and clear geometric patterns on old newsreel films. If the scanner sees a perfect straight line or a perfect circle among lunar rocks on an old negative, it triggers a hidden smoothing algorithm. The smart machine thinks it is just a random emulsion defect, a scratch, or a speck of dust, and instantly replaces it with the texture of neighboring pixels without the operator's knowledge. With our own hands, we are creating a perfect digital reality where every trace of an outside presence or ancient architecture is erased automatically at the level of the reading hardware itself. This means that the most complex process of total censorship of the past was fully automated and embedded into the structure of American archives even before personal computers appeared. The digital restoration program that NASA so proudly presented to the press in the early 2000s was only the tip of a colossal iceberg of total deception. They spent millions of dollars from classified budgets to hire the best specialists in computer graphics and visual effects directly from Hollywood. Officially, these talented people were supposed to clean the historic footage of the first landing from noise, restore faded colors, and add clarity for modern televisions. But in reality, frame by frame, by hand, they were redrawing the history of the 20th century, turning unique analog documents into sterile, safe, censorship-approved cartoons. When a group of independent researchers tried in 2011 to request, through the courts, a spectral analysis of the first digital copies of the lunar mission, they were predictably denied. The reason for the denial was worded with stunning bureaucratic cynicism: protection of commercial rights and intellectual property of private software developers. The space agency simply hid government archives behind an impenetrable wall of corporate secrecy belonging to private software companies, eliminating any possibility of independent verification of the evidence. And if today you try to find even one original physical negative from the Apollo mission or from the 1947 Hangar footage, you will inevitably run into a solid wall of refusals. They will politely show you terabytes of perfect digital video in ultra-high resolution, where the gray lunar dust looks real beneath the boot. They will show you smiling heroes, a waving flag, and sharp panoramas of craters flooded with bright, clean sunlight from the New World. But you will never, under any circumstances, be able to verify what exactly was in the upper left corner of the 34th frame of the third secret reel, because that very upper left corner, like the physical reel itself, no longer exists on any material medium on this controlled planet. John Schmitt understood perfectly well what kind of catastrophe for humanity this global and total replacement of physical evidence with digital codes on screens was leading to. In his very last note, which he hid in a secret compartment under the wooden floor of his old house in Maine, he wrote a terrifying prophecy for our time. When the last person on Earth who saw the original silver negative with his own eyes dies, the government lie will become absolute truth. A new generation of researchers will study colored pixels on monitors and argue about the direction of shadows without understanding one simple and terrifying thing. They are arguing about sets and backdrops that we ourselves drew on restoration tables under a secret order from Washington back in '74. The real history of humanity remained forever there, on fragile nitrate strips that burned long ago in the disposal furnaces of Greenbelt under the strict supervision of men in plain clothes. And that gray ash of the burned past is the most expensive and terrifying price humanity obediently paid for its illusion of calm and comfortable ignorance. Official school textbooks will continue, year after year, to claim that outer space is completely empty, and that in 1947 an ordinary weather balloon fell in New Mexico. Millions of people will firmly believe that great scientific discoveries are recorded by the state for the ages and reliably preserved in libraries. But the stone-dead silence of Maryland's underground bunkers continues to guard very different, deep, and extremely inconvenient secrets of the last century. And the 13 galvanized boxes of Project Nightfall still invisibly wait for someone who can decipher their hidden analog traces, half erased by time along the margins, traces that proved impossible to fully and finally erase, even with the most powerful government laser or the most advanced American smoothing algorithm, because any digital lie, even the most flawless one, always leaves behind missed, accidental analog pages according to the laws of physics. And our main task is to keep searching stubbornly for those lost pages among the century-old dust of abandoned archives, private journals, and erased logbooks. The conclusions from this story, as with all previous episodes on our channel, are yours alone to make, based exclusively on facts and logic. Thank you for digging down into this frightening archival depth with me, and for not being afraid to look behind the curtain of the official Space Chronicle. Subscribe to our channel, be sure to leave your detailed comments under this video, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss new investigations. Every like and every thoughtful response from you is a direct, powerful strike against the monolithic wall of oblivion that major corporations and officials have been building around our minds for decades. Guard your thoughts from outside influence. Never trust beautiful and perfect images on the screens of your devices. And I'll see you soon in the next investigations into the hidden history of our world.